Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. My name is Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is November 3rd, 2021, and I am delighted and honored to have with us today my friend and colleague, Michael Svard. Michael is probably well known to a lot of people tuning in. He is Israel's preeminent human rights attorney. He is the voice that many of us turn to understand what is happening, and also as a lighthouse to understand what rocks lie ahead. So Michael, welcome to Occupied Thoughts today. Thank you for making time for us.
Thank you, Lara. You're too kind.
No. So I asked Michael to come on the show today to talk about the situation with Israel's declaration a little over a week ago of 6 of the most preeminent or prominent Palestinian human rights groups to be terror groups. We've been doing a series of conversations on this. You can listen to the podcast or watch the videos on our website, www.fmep.org. I really wanted to get Michael here to give us sort of the most authoritative look at what's going on, and insights on how we should understand what the stakes are and what can happen now. So let's just dig right into this. Michael, so on the what happened question, I mean, for a lot of people, there's been a lot of talk about this. I want to go into some background. For a lot of people, this seems like it just came out of the blue, right? So there was nothing, and then suddenly Israel must have had this evidence showed up, and they're designating these 6 groups as terror organizations. So is that true? I mean, is it new? Is it out of the blue? And assuming if the answer is no, then talk to us about the timing and the targeting of these specific organizations.
So yeah, I mean, one of the problems these organizations and those who support them face now is that people think it came out of the blue. It came suddenly. Probably something came up now, and there was no other way. Well, the truth is that it didn't start now, and it did not come out of the blue. These organizations were targeted for the last 4 years, at least, if not more, by the Israeli government, by the different Israeli governments. And targeting them began even before that by Israeli radical right-wing organizations like NGO Monitor. And in order to fully understand what happened and why it happened, one needs to go back really to 2018, 2019, and go out of the Ministry of Defense and into the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, headed then by Gilad Ardan, now the Israeli ambassador to the UN. And basically what Gilad Ardan and his staff did in the Ministry of Strategic Affairs was to suck into their databases the different reports of Israeli right-wing organizations and take their policy papers and transform them into official government policy. And so what happened was that they have designed this new category, not of terror organizations, but delegitimization organizations. And in order to fit the category of delegitimization, one did not have to engage in terror activity, but rather with political activity that, in the eyes of the Israeli government, was harmful to the Israeli interest, to the Israeli policy. Now, these organizations, and those of you who never heard the name Al-Haq or DCI Palestine or Adamir, you should know these are very old, 40 years, 30-year-old human rights organizations, very professional, known around the world, members in all the umbrella organizations of human rights organizations, have, some of them have official status in the UN. They have very good reputation, and the entire international civil society rests on their reports and their work. And there's a lot of collaboration between international and Israeli human rights organizations and them. Now, these organizations have been targeted by the Ministry of Strategic Affairs because of mainly 2 of their the political activities. One is BDS, promoting BDS, and the other is ICC, promoting International Criminal Court investigations into alleged crimes committed by Israelis. Now, you can like it, you can dislike it, but this is a political act that even in Israel today is not illegal. It is not illegal in Israel to promote BDS. It is not illegal, it's not an offense in Israel today to promote ICC investigations. So this is purely political. And so once they were identified as major actors in this arena, the strategy that was adopted in order to combat or target these organizations was to dry out their funds, to convince the donating countries, the donor governments, to stop funding, to stop providing resources to these organizations, knowing that these organizations are funded only, almost exclusively, by Western governments, not by any, dubious Gulf foundations or governments. And so drying out their or shutting down the flow of resources from mainly Western European countries and the EU was the method chosen, and the means to get the European consent for such an act was to defame these organizations as having links to the PFLP, to the Palestinian People's Front for Liberation of Palestine, and of course they did not have evidence that would make a charge like that, but they had all kinds of pieces of guilt by association type of facts. This guy, 40 years ago, was a PFLP member and he sat in Israeli prison for 6 months. The other guy, his father was a PFLP inmate, and so on and so forth, creating a puzzle of different guilt by association charges. So that was already in beginning of 2019, the Ministry of Strategic Affairs published a report called Terrorists in Suits, which made these allegations, but basically was then used a language of a hesitant language saying, probably it looks like there's evidence that, and so on. The European governments did not buy into this. They looked at the reports. They had delegations from the Israeli MFA, Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, asking them to stop funding, and they have made it clear that this is not enough. They know the work of these organizations. The evidence that Israel has presented is definitely not enough, and so they will continue to fund these organizations because this is their calling as European countries post-Second World War commitment to human rights and democratization. The timeline shows that the second wave of such Israeli advocacy to end funding for these organizations was in May of 2021, after the arrest of several employees of a seventh organization, not one of those six, called the Health Workers Committee. So two accountants from that seventh organization were laid off by the organization on charges that they stole money. They were then arrested by the Israeli Shabak, the Israeli Secret Service, and interrogated for many weeks. They have said in their interrogations that they have diverted funds from that seventh organization to the PFLP. They have also said, when asked which other organizations in Ramallah are known to be PFLP, part of the PFLP community, they mentioned those six organizations, among others. They have never worked in any of these organizations. They had not presented any evidence about these organizations being part of the PFLP. And by the way, what does it mean to be part of any political party? All Palestinian political parties, including the Fatah and the PLO, which Israel has signed agreements with, are still considered terrorist organizations under Israeli law. So in any event, with that new astonishing evidence, the Israeli government, again, the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs went to the European governments and again asked them, demanded that they stop funding these organizations. And again, the European countries, the European government said, no, this is nothing. You have nothing here. Some governments even said, you know what? We will embark on a thorough examination of the accounts of the organizations that we donate to. And indeed, they've done that. And recently, they came back to the Israeli government saying, we found nothing. Not a single cent of our money was diverted to any goal that is not purely the human rights work that they do. So that was a complete failure of the Israeli advocacy to stop funding. And then came the designations. So that's the, in order to understand what we see overground, we see the fruits of the designation, we see the tree that is the designation. But in order for that to grow, you have all these roots, all this history that shows the motivation behind the designations. And the designation, after the failure of a consensual, of convincing the European government to stop funding, the designations makes it possible for the government of Israel unilaterally to block all transfers to Ramallah. So this is what the Israeli government has done. And the reason that is exposed from this history is the political work that is done by these organizations, and the reference to links to a terror organization is only a cover-up. It's only a front to the real reason.
So let me follow up. I think one of the questions, again, I'm trying to play little devil's advocate. I think one question some people are asking is, fine, Michael Svard, you know this issue well. You're a prominent lawyer. You're a serious guy. How is it that you feel so comfortable defending these groups now when the Israelis claim there's new evidence that came up since this last round of going to the Europeans with evidence the Europeans said was nothing? How is it you're so confident there isn't something new that would justify not merely arresting people, which they haven't done, but literally, shutting down these organizations entirely?
So I have 100 reasons. I'll mention 3. First of all, I know them. I don't know all 6 the same way. I know 3 of them very well. I know DCI Palestine, I know Adamir, and I know Al-Haq, which I'm representing now. By the way, it is fair disclosure, I have been asked by Al-Haq to represent them. This podcast, I am on my personal capacity. I'm not speaking on behalf of Al-Haq, but I have agreed to represent them. So I know them well. I know their work. I know they are serious, professional, independent human rights organizations. That's one. And so I don't believe that there is anything in the allegations that they have been promoting things that are the opposite of human rights, terrorism. Second, the Israeli government would not disclose its evidence. And for me, it's a major proof that they understand that if they disclose the evidence that they have, the complete evidence that they have against these organizations, it will all collapse. Everybody will see that they are actually naked. When a government is doing something like that, which is probably one of the most authoritarian acts a government can do, outlaw human rights organizations, civil society organizations, which are the backbone of the Palestinian cry for democratization, for human rights. By the way, whoever did it is ready to delay probably a generation or more any chance that the Palestinian society will be a democratic and human rights respecting society. That's what they are doing. I don't know if that's what they want, but that's what will happen, because these organizations are the ones who bring into Palestine the cry for freedom of speech, the tolerance to dissenting voices, the struggle against, using torture in investigations. They have been critical of the PA government not less than they are of the Israeli government. So that's the second thing, that the fact that the government conceals its evidence, would not show it to the public, would not even show it to the representatives of the public, to journalists. They can show it to journalists, and the journalists will abide to the law that says that they cannot disclose it, but they will come back to the public and say, well, what we saw is or isn't convincing. They wouldn't do it. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is as follows. You know what, for the sake of argument, let's assume that they show me the golden evidence. Yes, someone in one of the organizations or in all six was involved in an act of terrorism, pure act of terrorism, and someone else diverted money to terrorist organizations. What do you do then? Do you outlaw the whole organization with all its employees? Do you turn away hundreds of thousands of beneficiaries that throughout the years have been provided service by these organizations? Let's say that the American government finds out that a certain hospital, its executive director is a terrorist, and someone else on the board has been diverting money to ISIS. Will the American government outlaw the hospital, ruin the hospital, or will it, in a very focused manner, surgically deal with those people on the board of that hospital that did something wrong? No one, even the government, even the Minister of Defense, even the Shabak, the Israeli Secret Service, no one argues that these organizations are artificial, have been established as a front, that they don't really do any work, human rights work. No one argues that. They argue something else. They said, yes, they have been for the 40 years real civil society organization. They have genuine activity, but they were infiltrated with some elements and so on and so forth. Well, in that case, you cannot outlaw the whole organization. You have to deal with the people that you think, or the acts that you think are illegal. And the fact that this is not the way chosen shows that what is a matter of concern for the government is not the elements that were infiltrated allegedly to these organizations, but the fact that the organizations exist. And we get back to the political work they do. This is the only motivation that makes sense.
That's a very compelling answer. I will say I did a podcast last week with Dawood Kutab about the Mohammed Halabi case. This is the employee of World Vision. And I was struck when someone said to me, well, obviously, there's people doing terrible things and why aren't they arresting them? And I thought of the Mohammed Halabi case where they've got a guy that they arrested and in big, loud noise about we've caught someone, we have, absolute rock solid evidence of terror. And 5 years later, World Vision investigated, Australian government investigated, and 5 years later, he's still in jail. And even the Jerusalem Post is essentially arguing you're holding an innocent man because you don't want to admit that you don't have a case. It is quite striking to go about it this way. I want to shift gears and ask you about the role of confessions. From what you said earlier, and certainly from the gossip that a lot of us are picking up about what was presented to the Europeans previously and what is almost certainly being presented to the Americans now, most, if not almost all, of the evidence that is being presented to back up these cases is based on the confessions of a few people, confessions made under interrogation by Israel's security services. I'm not a lawyer, you are. My understanding of the law is that in a normal court of law, confessions made in this kind of situation would not be considered, slam dunk evidence. It might be a thread that you will follow, but it's not evidence, right? Can you talk about how the Israeli courts view evidence when Palestinians implicate other Palestinians, whether in the military court system or in the regular Israeli court system, how these are viewed and how seriously they're taken? And by the way, is there any sense that this is something that might be recanted later by the people who confessed, and would that make a difference?
So I want to make a comment about the Halabi case in the context of what you're asking now. 5 years. 5 years. Do you know what will happen if it will take 5 years for us to disprove the allegations in the case of the 6 organizations? They will not exist anymore. In fact, I don't think they will exist in a year's time if the designations are not reversed. Definitely not in the form they exist today. This is not some charity from Gaza that is or is not affiliated to the Hamas, and if designated and cannot get their funding through the international banking system, they will think, how will I get it maybe in suitcases in cash from Qatar or wherever. No, these organizations know only how to do things over the table in the very legitimate banking, international banking system with all the audits that involves that. So, you know, Israel might lose in the Halabi case, but it succeeded. And that's what we should all be concerned about this case. Because it's one thing to win a case, and it's another thing to be successful in a campaign. And we might win this case, but fail, or not, fail in the attempt to safeguard Palestinian civil society.
Just to add, for folks who don't know the Halabi case, in this case, World Vision, the guy's still in jail, still hasn't had any sort of, open trial or anything else. But in the meantime, World Vision has walked away from Palestine. So it succeeded in getting World Vision to end its activities and end its funding in Gaza, which was the goal. And
also in Halabi case, there's probably a very unique person who would not accept plea bargains that are offered to him time and again, every time better and better. Not all people will, be so stubborn and be ready to stay in prison, not be with their families. And in the case of the 2 accountants and the other people that were arrested from the Health Workers Committee, the admissions that were, I don't know what were the Shabak techniques that were used against them, but we know that the Israeli Secret Service uses interrogation techniques that amount to torture. Not in every case, not in every interrogation, but even if it does not amount to torture, they have all kinds of techniques that breach the autonomy of the will, and people sometimes do things they're not free to decide not to do. And so in such cases, and those people who were charged in the context of the Health Workers Committee, their trials have not begun too. I mean, they've begun, but the evidence have not been heard yet. And from what I understand, they too are planning or are arguing that their confessions were extracted from them in an illegal manner. And what happens then usually, and I'm not talking about this case because I'm not representing those people, I'm not involved in the case and I don't know what's going on there, but I do know the pattern. And the pattern is that once the defendant argues these arguments about being tortured or being subjected to inhumane or illegal treatment, what comes next is offers of plea bargains. And I urge you all, if you hear in coming days and weeks that a plea bargain was reached in these cases, where people have admitted to be, to do things for the PFLP on behalf of this 7th organization, not about these 6. Take it with a grain of salt. People will do a lot in order to get out of prison and be back with their families.
So shifting gears here, we did a webinar last Friday with representatives of all 6 of the organizations. For folks who haven't watched it, I would encourage you to do so. It was really excellent. It was an opportunity for these organizations to introduce themselves to the world. A lot of people didn't know about them, to talk about how they see this attack and what you have called a declaration of war against civil society. One of the critiques we got about that webinar is that at no point did I put each one of our guests on the spot and say, are you now or have you ever been a supporter of the PFLP? something really along those lines. I think because for some people, they just want them to say no and they can point to that. And some people want to say, they hemmed and hawed and that proves they're guilty. Can you talk about why the framing of that question is wrong? And you already referred to the fact that, all the strains of political activism in the West Bank are still illegal under Israeli law. And what is can you just answer that question for the people who said to me, why didn't you ask it? I know why I didn't ask it. I know why I thought it was improper for me to ask it. Can you frame that from a legal perspective, why that is the wrong way to be talking about this?
Well, first of all, it doesn't matter in the context of the designations if a certain individual is a member or not a member, if he or she identifies herself as a supporter or a member of whatever organization. That's not the test of whether the organization she works for is part of that other entity. So even if you would ask that question, and even if one of the directors of one of the organizations would say, you know what, yes, I am a member, I was a member, I am supporting the PFLP, that doesn't justify designating the organization. But the main issue here is that Israel has constructed a spider web of orders, designations, proclamations, and laws that make almost any Palestinian political act an act of terrorism. And any political group in Palestine, any significant political faction has been designated, whether either as a terrorist organization or an unlawful association or all kinds of terms of illegality. And so a young Palestinian who wants to be politically active has absolutely no way to join any political party and not violate Israeli law. Now, there's a big difference, of course, between being a member of a party or supporting a party, a political party that is maybe represented in the Palestinian parliament because of the agreements between Israel and the PLO, by the way, and being a member of a military wing that is engaged in violence. These are two different things.
Actually, can you actually spell that out for people who are listening when you talk about a member of the parliament? Can you really spell out a little more what you're saying?
I'm saying that the Palestinian parliament, who has not had elections for the last 15 years, when they did have elections, the members of parliament were elected according to parties, to political parties. And all of these political parties are on the list of illegal associations or terrorist organizations in Israel. So membership in any of them would amount to illegal act. What I wanted to say is that there is a difference between that and being involved with a military wing or a terrorist wing, whatever you want to call it. And the Israeli, and here I come to the definition of terrorist organization under the Israeli Counterterrorism Act of 2016, because it's important to understand that Israel conflates between political work and violence and military or terrorist activity purely. The Israeli definition, the Israeli law definition of a terrorist organization has two options. One option is, I think, something we will all agree about, that the terrorist organization is an entity that carries out acts of terror. Let's assume, for the simplicity of the matter, that we all agree what acts of terror are, okay? Something to do with violence against civilians. So an entity that carries out acts of terror is a terror organization. That's one. The second option is the problematic one. And it says that any entity that provides service to or has links, ties to the first type is also a terrorist organization. Now, if the notions of providing service to or having links, ties to, is extremely blurry and can be interpreted in a very, very wide way. And so the potential of the recursive nature of that definition can potentially, and in fact does, swallow the entire Palestinian society. Because anyone is either providing service to or has links, ties to someone who provides service to or has ties to, eventually, a terrorist organization. And so that is how Israel has captured both political work, because what is, for example, El-Haq accused of in the designation? Not of providing funds to the PFLP, not providing services to the PFLP, but advancing, I'm quoting, advancing in the international arena, the goals of the PFLP. So if the goal of one of the goals of the PFLP is, for example, boycott on settlement produce, and El-Haq advances that, they advance the goal of the PFLP. And here I want to end with the following. Words matter, concepts matter. If everyone is anti-Semite, then no one is. If everyone is a terrorist, then no one is. And it's a crime to widen these very, I'm secular, but very sacred concepts in a way that makes them nothing.
Wow, that was very, very powerfully stated. Thank you. So picking up on where this takes us, I want to talk about implications, and you've talked about this in other forums. I want to get you on the record here. So when we talk about implications of these designations, you've said if these stand, these organizations won't exist probably in a year, right? And that's because of funding, first and foremost. The funding gets cut off. You've talked about this will delay democracy and human rights for Palestinians for at least a generation, right? Can you talk more broadly about the consequences? I've sort of framed it as, the first order consequences are the consequences for Palestinians directly. Right. And then, we've heard about efforts to target people like you, Israelis who are defending them under the NGO law. It seems that you are yourself in some jeopardy. Can you look out further for Israel, for the international community, for human rights defenders writ large, and the model the model this gives a kosher stamp to for national behavior? So
a designation under the Israeli Counterterrorism Act, the designation of an entity, an organization as a terrorist organization is the corporate equivalent of capital punishment. It's an execution. This entity is not allowed to exist anymore, to operate. And in order to coerce the denial of existence of that entity, the law encircles the entity with a belt, a very thick belt of administrative powers that are vested with the Israeli public authorities, and with prohibitions, the violations of which are criminal, that apply to all. And so the administrative powers allow the government to, to expropriate all the property that belongs to the organization, to block transfers, etc., to close their offices. The criminal offenses that are associated with a terrorist organization relates both to those who are members of the organization or serve the organization in official positions, but also to those who are third parties, who are not members, but have some kind of links and relationship with the organization, and they have to sever all ties. So, for example, when I posted on Facebook and tweeted on Twitter what I think about El-Haq, that it's a marvelous organization that has done super important work. And even a picture of myself in their offices, standing on a podium with the emblem of El-Haq several years ago. And I wrote that this statement in and of itself may amount to the crime of supporting a terrorist organization. And how do you say it? Lo and behold, a right-wing organization has already managed to file a complaint against me and my colleagues, directors of Israeli human rights organizations that made a solidarity visit to El-Haq offices, meeting all the six delegation of the six organizations, charging us with this exact crime of supporting a terrorist organization. There are so many things that are now, this designation is not only a challenge to the Palestinian society, it's in many ways even more a challenge to the Israeli peace camp, the Israeli human rights community. The government has sketched a line. On one side, there are these human rights organizations, our colleagues, our friends. Where will we stand? Will we cross the line and stand with them on the other side of the law? Will we do that? Open question. But any ties with them, any work together with them, briefings on human rights issues to diplomats, to journalists, sharing data on human rights abuses. All these things are now criminal offense, may amount to criminal offenses, depending how you interpret this, and depending on the policy of investigations that the Israeli Ministry of Justice will apply. So there's a question not only whether these organizations will continue to operate in a year's time, but also how will the map of human rights activism in Israel-Palestine would look like? And will we, Israeli human rights groups and peace groups, will join forces with them? That's a big, big question. And of course, there's a question, the same type of question, about the international civil society and the international community. The Europeans are heavily invested in these organizations. They have been cultivating them, they have been funding them because they think that a viable just future for the Middle East depends on having a democratic society with vibrant civil society. And what Israel has done now is to cut off this tree that they have been cultivating or trying to cut off this tree that they have been cultivating for years. Will Europe once again be scared by Israel? Be too scared to do what they think, and I know they think the right thing would be to stand up to Israel. And they have the power to do so. Because if tomorrow the Irish government or the Swedish government declares that it will send another batch of donation to one of these organizations because they have a project that was signed 2 years ago, and because there are reports on, let's say, I'm just on LGBTQ rights in the Palestinian Authority that has to be printed out because it's already written. Let's see if the Israeli government will block that deposit, because if it does, that's a diplomatic crisis. And if the European government decide that they are not accepting the Israeli move that, as I said before, was done in order to circumvent their dismissal of the Israeli dossier, of the Israeli charges, they can win this. They can compel the Israeli government to reverse its very poor decision. So it's also a test to the international community, and of course, international civil society that I think if I was one of the Palestinian organizations, I would be, while extremely concerned about what's going on, what will be the future, my salary, my family, my freedom, but I would be very heartwarmed. You say heartwarmed? I will be very happy to see the reactions from the international civil society, which I think does show solidarity. And that's very, very important.
Yeah, the outpouring of solidarity, including from groups that are not Israel-Palestine focused, the recognition of what this tactic is and the threat it poses, I think has been encouraging. I would add, just for me watching this and watching NGO Monitor, Ministry of Strategic Affairs all these years, I tend to think that, regardless of what the Israeli NGO sector does going forward, for everyone who's worked with these groups in the past, if these designations stand, the effort will be to stain everyone with association with the terrorist organization for past work together, and to discredit every bit of information that's ever come out. Al-Haq, which produces, the best quality human rights information, it is celebrated worldwide because the quality of its work is so good. This is now going to be a basis for saying, don't read any of these reports. Anyone who's relied on them is wrong. To challenge people who've looked at, DCI Palestine. It's a way to say none of the facts matter. All that matters is terrorism. And if you talk about facts, you're supporting terrorism, which is a really quite terrifying framing. The last question I want to ask you, and then I will let you go because I know you're incredibly busy. I think a lot of us are not entirely clear on this question of what happens now. You said you're representing Al-Haq. I know other groups have found other people to represent them. What is available to these groups in terms of challenging, contesting these designations? And maybe just as important as what is available, or even more important, what is the prospect, given your experience as a lawyer in the Israeli system, what is the prospect for Palestinian organizations getting any kind of justice? And we talked about Mohammed Halabi, justice in a time frame where it can still be justice. Justice delayed is justice denied. What is the prospects for them receiving that kind of fair hearing and justice in the Israeli court system?
Well, the procedure that is laid down in the Israeli legislation provides the following process if the organizations choose to follow it. A designated entity has a right to file an objection to the designation with the Ministry of Defense within 60 days of the designation of the day the designation was signed. If they do so, then a panel of a committee of 3 members convenes. The 3 members are a retired district court judge, retired lawyer from the Attorney General's office, and a retired Shabak Secret Service officer. And this neutral and unbiased committee will hear the arguments that the designated entity will raise.
Sorry, just for people who are listening to this as a podcast and not watching the video, Michael's facial expression when he used the term neutral and unbiased suggested that he was not entirely serious with those terms, if I can say that.
Let's put it that way. The advisory committee that is vested with the power to advise the Minister of Defense on this matter has no representatives from civil society, has no representatives from human rights organizations, has no representatives from the, from the academia. It has only representatives that are former officials in the executive and a judge, right? And so if an objection is filed, because one has to understand the designation when it is first signed is considered to be a temporary designation. And now there is a process to make a decision whether to turn it into a permanent designation. And so if the designated entity decides not to file an objection, then almost automatically it becomes within 60 days a permanent designation. But if it does file an objection, then there is a process in which the Secret Service must respond to the objection Parts of the response would be passed on to the designated entity, but most of it, including all the evidence, would remain usually in secrecy, and ex parte would only be seen by the panel, not by the committee, not by the designated organization. And then at the end of that process, the advisory committee will make a recommendation. And then the Minister of Defense will make his final decision on whether to lift the temporary designation or to make it permanent. If he makes it permanent, then that decision can be judicially reviewed in a petition to the Israeli High Court of Justice. Now, historically, decisions made by the Israeli security apparatus have been the most immune from judicial intervention. Israeli courts, Israeli judges, Israeli administrative boards are known to accept almost, I don't want to say as a rubber stamp, because they're not a rubber stamp in the sense that they do have independence, and most of these institutions are professional. But there is a culture of sanctifying the position of the in Israel of the security establishment. And so I don't know of any case where a designated entity, and before the 2016 Act, we had the British mandatory emergency regulations, which allowed designation of entities as unlawful associations. And I don't know of any case where the Israeli Supreme Court and the Israeli High Court of Justice intervened in such a decision. So the chances are, when you look at the record, it doesn't look good. However, it's not a regular case. It's not a regular case. Not that there is any regular case, but this is different in any possible way. And also, these institutions, courts, do hear what's going on out of the courtroom. And the more there is outcry that this is an outrageous act, I think there's more chance that they will look into it more carefully. Now, I want to make clear, none of the 6 organizations has decided to go on this process. They might decide that they do not want to do it for many reasons, not only because of their chances, but also because they don't believe in the process, and I cannot blame them for that. I'm just explaining what kind of legal roots they have. And of course, the question of whether there will be a significant political, diplomatic pressure on Israel also will come into play here very much. So while the record is bleak, this is not a regular case.
Thank you. So that's actually a somewhat hopeful, small, tiny bit of hopeful note to end on. So I think we'll end there. Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your time and your analysis today. I know you're incredibly busy. I hope we'll be hearing and seeing you more. You're a very powerful voice, and we are grateful that you exist and are working on this. I want to thank our listeners and our watchers for tuning in. Make sure you check out the FMEP website, www.fmep.org, for a whole array of work that we're doing around this issue. And you should be, of course, subscribed by now to our podcast on Spotify or SoundCloud or iTunes, so you don't miss any of these great podcasts. And with that, I'm Laura Friedman, signing off for now. Take care, everyone, and thanks very much. Until the next episode.